Welcome, everyone. I'm Darcy Backyard with Prairie Public, former high school English and theater teacher. So I'll try to keep us clunking along. But like I said, I am also someone who's a little afraid of this whole poetry thing, which is why I think this chat is so important to help us as teachers be more comfortable with this whole range of stuff, because I have seen the power that poetry can have to help open doors for students. And I would like our two main co-host guests, Rebecca, if you'll start us off, just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about where you're joining us from, your background, and your connection to poetry.
Okay, and again, I'm Rebecca Engelman, and I am the Arts and Education Director for North Dakota Council on the Arts. And in that capacity, I manage several grant programs, and one of them that I manage is called the Poetry Out Loud program. My background, actually, I was a visual K-8 visual arts teacher for 20 years. And so much like you, Darcy, poetry, I like poetry, but it wasn't something that I was really comfortable with. Until I started doing the Poetry Out Loud program, it took me, I know the first year when I managed the program, I'm like, oh my gosh, what do I have to do with this program? Because it really wasn't in my wheelhouse. But after managing the program for 2 to 3 years and seeing the transformation that takes place with students through poetry and memorization and recitation, when they take that poem and they take it into their heart and it becomes their poem and then share it back out. The transformation that I saw with the students was just so engaging, and I could see the purpose of poetry, especially with the poems that when the student has the opportunity to choose the poem that sings directly to their heart, and not just the poem that the teacher selects, but one that they select their own. So that's a little bit about me, and I do manage that program, and I provide resources to teachers, and North Dakota Council on the Arts also provides additional funding to schools who would like to bring a North Dakota poet into their classroom to often do a takeoff or a beginning celebration for poetry out loud in their classrooms.
I'm Brian Geffre, and I teach at Shanley High School. Been teaching there for 25 years now. And I started as English and then moved to English and Latin, and now I teach only Latin. So I have not actually been in an English classroom for a little while, but I still am involved with poetry out loud. I'm a speech coach, so I'm involved that way. The Poetry Out Loud competition, I was involved from the very beginning because I really felt that this was a way to get kids involved with crafting their writing versus just writing something, because too many kids end up just looking at writing as something you just do to get done and not anything to do with actually having any art to it or having any kind of ability to share something beyond what is just, why can't you just say it? Why do you have to say it this way, kind of deal? So I've had a number of kids that have won it. We've also had a number of kids that have placed well, and so that's where I'm coming from. That's my experience with the Poetry Out Loud competition.
And we'll dive into some information here about Poetry Out Loud.
So again, Poetry Out Loud is a program sponsored by the National Endowment for the Arts and the Poetry Foundation. And what they do is they partner with all the state arts agencies across the nation to provide funding and resources to implement the Poetry Out Loud program across the nation. Approximately 29,500 North Dakota students have participated in Poetry Out Loud in the past 15 years, with over 3 million students nationally. It continues to grow. Of course, the programs can be very large in some states. In some other states, it's not quite as large, especially in more of our rural states. It seems to be slowly gaining steam there, where we have a lot of smaller school districts. I think that is one of the things that I'd like to just talk about really quickly, is that you don't have to be a big school to participate in Poetry Out Loud. This year, we have schools that are as small as 4 students participating in their, I believe it's in their senior class, in Stanley, North Dakota, to schools that are nearly 400. So we welcome students of all sizes. We also, I want teachers to know that they don't have to join the program thinking that they have to be highly competitive. It's more about the process of learning poetry and using some, I mean, they provide such wonderful resources that we send out to the teachers, and they're updated every year. You know, those first 2 years is really just kind of a figuring out process for a lot of our teachers. The first few years they're doing it as they familiarize themselves to the resources and how it fits into their school. I know one thing a lot of the teachers say is, oh, my students are they're going to really buck having to memorize something. It is very interesting to see how, if teachers kind of stick with it, how that culture changes within the school. We've seen some really wonderful transformations where it becomes just a part of what the expectation in junior or senior English, part of the, it's integrated into the curriculum. Every student learns, selects a poem and recites within their classroom. There's certain students are selected then to move on to a school-wide competition. And by the way, the school competition can be as small as 2 students competing. In some of our schools, that's all they have, are 2 students competing against each other. And then one of the students moves forward to the state competition. So again, it's more about the process and students learning to analyze, select a poem that speaks to them, learning to pull it apart and analyze it for meaning, take it into their heart, and then learning how to memorize it and present it back to a group and share that deep meaning of the poem with others.
To add to that, I would say that what I did and what I do with poetry is I get our kids to take it into their heart first. They actually have to look at poems that they enjoy. They don't have to understand it just yet, but that they enjoy to read. They have to read it out loud, and it just has to hit them. And with a number of our kids, they find stuff that is really complex, got a lot of really difficult lines and that sort of thing. And if they find something they like or even love, the memorization part becomes very easy, very easy. Our very first person that we took to the national tournament, he was a football player, and he decided this was going to be something he would try. And he memorized, can't remember it was like almost 60 lines. He memorized that overnight. And yeah, it was absolutely one of those things that he just took to. And when they interviewed him later on, he has actually on one of the earlier interviews for Poetry Out Loud, he stated that, I was a football player, but now I'm a football player that recites poetry. And it was really I think an eye-opening experience for me, that this actually was something that a lot of different people could get involved with. That it wasn't.
I'm gonna piggyback on that too, because what I've noticed over the years of providing this program, and what I'm hearing from teachers, is where this is different from, say, your regular speech competitions, where students choose to be on a speech team and compete in poetry, is when it's implemented in the classroom, you often see those students that discover poetry who otherwise wouldn't. The students that are those, sometimes the quiet students, the ones who you would think are least likely to embrace poetry or least likely to participate in something like this are the students that often rise to the surface through poetry out loud and implementing any type of poetry in your classroom.
Getting kids to memorize stuff is sometimes difficult, but when you do it in front of them, like I have a poem that I would usually pull out by Robert Frost, Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. And I would do that the way in which I thought they should try, and then get them to practice it in class, practice it with their friends. And, you know, most of them are still just out, I'm going to memorize this poem, and that's basically what they're going to do. But then you got those few that take the poem and then they start looking deeper into what the meaning of the poem is. And because they like it, they have vested interest in knowing what it means. So they start looking up stuff. They start asking questions. And I encourage them to look at the poem and look at the sounds of the poem. Are the sounds actually helping you with that, with understanding? And, you know, I've never really been scared to work with poetry in class, but that doesn't mean that I understood everything about teaching poetry in class. So this gave me an opportunity to get kids saying poetry, doing poetry without making it like the poetry I had when I was in college and in high school. Just that overbearing, you have to understand this, and this is great stuff, and I couldn't understand why it was great or understand it. Where these kids now are getting that, and they're understanding stuff without having to go through the same torment that I did when I was in high school.
Yeah. I'd like to just share something that I always share with the Poetry Out Loud teachers after they register. I love to share this one. It's from Kim Davidson from Russ Holt High School in Russ Holt, South Dakota. And she wrote, "There are two keys to Poetry Out Loud that make it different than my former teaching of poetry. First and foremost, importantly, students choose their own poem to study and perform. Given enough time, students will search for a poem which speaks to them in some way. I leave the study of the poem open-ended, using writing, art, and theatrics as they practice and search for meaning. This allows students a level of comfort in expressing their ideas, not the ideas given them by the teacher, the spark notes, or the experts." I think that was just so, you know, and then second, she talks about memorizing the poem to perform it. She's like, getting a poem by heart implies getting it by mind and memory and understanding and delight, and then being able to share it out that way. So just those two things she felt by kind of following the format of Poetry Out Loud really helped her to help the students to find a real love of poetry and embrace it.
Your examples and the examples that people are sharing in the chat as well really speaks to all of these things of just like that poise and the confidence. And I love Brian's story. And it did make me think of, as they're exploring all of these different things, yes, Poetry Out Loud itself is a solo competition. But if you're using the Poetry Out Loud as a springboard for really just bringing these resources into your classroom, there's no reason why you couldn't have teams do a group performance of a poem where they really do dig into who is in the poem and what are the sounds in the poem and what is the environment in the poem and how can they bring that this is the theater teacher in me, but how can they bring that mini play to life to really show us what is going on in the context of that poem.
And if you're a middle school teacher or even schools who may not feel like they're ready to actually participate full-heartedly in Poetry Out Loud, please let me know. I'd be very happy to send the resources to you and let you explore them and use them in your classroom. And there's quite a few middle schools across the nation who, because their high school is very involved in Poetry Out Loud, they conduct their own mini middle school Poetry Out Loud competitions to kind of prime the kids and get them excited. And so it becomes, like I said earlier, mentioned earlier, it becomes a part of the culture of the school, where it's kind of just an accepted thing that we all do poetry. Everyone memorizes a poem, and it's not considered awkward or uncomfortable. I see that Josh Eddy is here from Washburn, and Josh is one of our newest schools that's participating in Poetry Out Loud this year. They actually applied for one of our Poets in Schools grant, and were able to bring the poet Joe Davis to their school. And Elizabeth and I had the pleasure of being up there on, last week, Monday, was it a week ago? And had the opportunity to just observe how that all takes place in the school. And Josh, it'd be great if you could share something about being a first-time school and what that experience was like for your students.
Sure. Well, I just had gotten the mailers that you had sent out, and we had been doing some poetry as a spark of some short writings early on in the year. And so I was like, well, why don't I try this with my juniors? So that's what I'm doing with my just this one class this year. And it was actually something else that I was looking at, getting Joe Davis into the school for, and then I learned about this grant opportunity, and just kind of was kismet that it all worked out the way that it did. The grant process was very easy to fill out and apply for, and so we started talking to the poet early October, and everything was, and then we met last week, so it really only took a few weeks for everything to really happen. And like I said, it was a really good experience for all the kids. He did a performance of his poetry, and just kind of the way that he interacts with students, and it's a large group, and then he also did some small group activities with the students, and specifically with the ones who are doing Poetry Out Loud. He did some activities that helped the students think about making the poetry their own, as we've already kind of discussed, and how they can do that through their recitation. And so, yeah, I was very pleased with the entire process, and I'm excited to see how that sparks their going forward with picking out their poems and making it their own as we go forward.
And of course, I think, again, I just want to emphasize first and second year teachers should really just allow themselves to enjoy the process, and more than worrying about, what's it, am I going to have a great student, and he's going to really perform really outstanding at the state competition. Just to come to the state competition and come to enjoy watching that. If you've never been to the state Poetry Out Loud competition, I really encourage you to come. It's such a wonderful celebration of the students. Every one of those students is stellar. Every one of them has worked hard to get to that point, to memorize 3 poems, and the courage and the composure that it takes for them to come up on that big stage at the Heritage Center and stand alone and recite their poem is, it's very inspiring to see those young people in that venue. The National Poetry Out Loud website has just been updated this year, and they really did a wonderful job. They streamlined things, and there's videos in there that the teachers can use to help them show their students, like if you're going, what does dramatic appropriateness look like? those types of things, so that teachers and students can get a feel for what is the expectation, because it is a little bit different from your regular speech tournaments, in that Poetry Out Loud, the POL program, kind of asks that you not over dramatize and it doesn't become an act, that they want the words to speak for themselves.
The Poetry Out Loud experience is, you know, kids see the poetry slams and the high emotions and all of that, and that turns, it's not quite what the Poetry Out Loud experience really is about. It is really about using the words and allowing the words to really sink into a person's brain, a person's heart, and then be able to say that in such a way that lets other people know exactly what you saw in this poem. And so overly emoting kind of makes it feel fake. And one of those buzzwords I use with the kids is don't make it fake. It's not fake emotion. This is, what is it that you really see in this poem? And if it is emotional, then put that in there, but it doesn't have to be a fake emotion. If you have studied the poem and looked at it and really have that in mind, what the author's trying to say, then it's just naturally going to come out of the way you say it.
Well said, Brian. That's great. There are some, if you go to the North Dakota Poetry, we have our own website too for North Dakota Poetry Out Loud. There are some wonderful videos of past champions that every year the person the student that becomes our North Dakota State champion, Prairie Public creates a little mini documentary on that student. And I think what the students share about Poetry Out Loud is really informational, and you get to see snippets of their presentations. So that's very helpful too in seeing that. Emily was this year's, so we could share that one too. And below her would be Maria. Maria's is interesting in that she is a second language learner. And that is one thing that nationally we hear about, is that students who often struggle learning English language, or it's a second language to them, that poetry, studying poetry and learning to analyze the poem and recite it back is quite powerful. So these are all our past. Oh, Jacoby, well, there's some amazing kids in there. Boy, it's fun to see all their faces again.
And then here you have that link to the National Poetry Out Loud Champions too. And so those are right here for you. I enjoyed using some of these videos as models for students, you know, like kind of as exemplar texts. They can be really helpful ways of just, instead of just reading a poem in class, listening to the performance of a poem is just different than just reading the poem on the page.
And it's different from student to student, because it's so interesting in competition when 2 or 3 students have the same poem, and how they recite it, the meaning of the poem changes, because each student analyzes the poem a little bit differently. Yeah, this slide here is just showing our timeline right now for Poetry Out Loud. The deadline to register was November 1st, but I definitely will take any school that would like to register within the next couple weeks. We'll definitely do that. The Poets in Schools grant application deadline is December 15th. We've provided 15 grants, so I mean not 15, 5. I think we have funding enough for 1 or 2 more Poets in Schools, and those are non-matching grant funds up to $2,000 to bring a poet into your school. The state competition, the deadline to register your school champion is February 1st, and then the competition will take place February 24th in Bismarck, with nationals, the student being selected and moving on to nationals in April.
The way we've done it in our school is multiple ways. But my favorite way is get the whole school involved. We got everybody in from 10th, 11th, and 12th grade to memorize a poem. We'd have classroom competitions, and then we'd pare that down to 2 or 3 from each class and have semifinals after school sometime and pick 6. And then we would go from there, and they would say their poems in front of the entire school. And we tried to do different things, put some music between each of the poems. We've also done some competitions to where we've asked kids questions about poetry, about Shakespeare, tried to give away prizes. We've done small gift cards for kids that have placed in class. And there's lots of other options, lots of other things that I've thought of, but haven't had a chance to implement simply because of time, because of, you know, teaching is teaching and life gets in the way. Once you get to the state competition, that day, I like to bring other kids with me because then they can see kind of what they can give the kid, the champion, the school champion, some support. They can see what other schools are doing, what other things there are to do besides football, volleyball, basketball. There are other things in the world besides sports. If we go and end up going to the national tournament, then I always insist that the teacher goes along because 1, it's a coaching opportunity. 2, it is kind of an opportunity for you to see what a national tournament is like, a national competition is like.
Yeah, the state champion is they pay for the student, of course, and for 1 chaperone. Like Brian said, seeing the National Poetry Out Loud competition is a wonderful experience. It just all comes home and you really get the big picture of how really amazing the whole process is. And the students that come are so diverse, the diversity of students from all different nationalities and cultures and backgrounds and ages. And they are a wonderful group of kids and very accepting and open, and they hang together for 3 to 4 days, and they actually become, a lot of them, I believe, become friends over that time.
Anyone who's middle school, high school, as this slide points out, these things are they're directly tied to Common Core standards.
Oh,
so
they
are
really,
it's going to fulfill a lot of the learning objectives that you're working on and can really tie into a lot of different units. So again, you don't have to do the competition in order to utilize the resources.
Mm-hmm.
And there are these great tools for teachers. If you just go to the poetryoutloud.org website. And
we have schools that are doing much like Brian said, where it's school-wide. We have other teachers that are just doing it within their own classroom. Sure. Or they're just having just their junior classes do it, or maybe just a single class. So it really is flexible. And as long as there's a student competition between 2 students, that's considered part of the program. You know, so that the student coming forward for the state competition has at least had a recitation competition with 1 other person. And then they can still move forward. So it really meets the needs of all size schools. And after school programs, I've seen it implemented in after school programs and as independent study, with a teacher just working with a group of students that wanted to do poetry out loud. And there's a teacher that's the lead teacher and just assigns it as independent study for the students and meets with them to help them probably fine-tune their recitations and conduct the in-school competition.
I really enjoyed the audio clips from the very first thing that was put out with Dana Joya. I would play that. I just and as you would go through the different explanations of things, I would pause that and talk about it a little bit more in class. Just listening to those people recite a poem and then talk about what it meant to them, like David Schwimmer did an explanation. And I thought that was, being as he was just coming out of Friends, and now Friends is like a really big deal again. I guess a lot of kids are watching Friends on Netflix and such. Listening to somebody who is a television actor, and yet he takes reciting poetry very seriously, and he did a rendition of the Jabberwocky that was really good. That portion of the program was really helpful when I was in class.
I think today on our North Dakota Poetry Out Loud Facebook page, I just posted a Shack reading a poem. O'Neill. So I mean, it's just interesting, these people that you would not expect to be enjoying poetry, memorizing poems and sharing them out. So it speaks to all types of people.
PBS Learning Media has this collection called Poetry Everywhere, and it has similar things to what you were both just describing, of these just famous people reciting poems and talking about poetry. And so you can see that they're kind of broken down by topic over here, kind of gathered into different little clusters, and each one has different people reading poems. And you can see they're really short, they're a minute and a half long because it's just a poem. So it's not like it's this huge thing. But another resource, if you're just looking for people, professionals, people of different stature reciting poetry. And you exist to help support these teachers. So I'm assuming they can reach out to you if they have questions. To you and Elizabeth.
Yeah, I try to be very accessible to them, and if I don't know the answers, I will look for the answers and get back to them. I think all the teachers got the Poetry Out Loud brochure. I think I sent it out 2 or 3 times to every teacher in the state of North Dakota, and they've been getting emails from me too, because I went to every school's website to find their emails. So that's been because I do want to make sure that teachers know this is available, and that we're here to support them and to provide resources.
So I would like to close out by taking some questions, but also sharing some other ideas. So I know we have a full spectrum of teachers on the chat who teach everything from first grade to middle school to high school English. So what are your thoughts? What's been percolating as you've been sitting and listening here about how could you help utilize some of these resources in order to help you kind of power up your poetry skills? Or what just random ideas are coming to you as you're listening to this of things you might try in your classroom?
I love the performance implications, thinking of our speaking and listening goals that we're working on. And I teach first grade, and just the implications there, where teaching kids how to perform, how to speak, how to listen, eyes on the speaker. I think that could be really neat in my classroom.
Oh yeah, I agree. I think that would be just delightful to allow them and encourage them to just memorize a simple little poem and share it. What a great way to start the process.
Yeah, I think first graders, at least my experience of first graders, is there's always somebody that's willing to go first, and then everybody else has to join in. And I think that would be an excellent way to get kids to, they could all memorize the same poem. They could do one of their own. It sounds like it would be an excellent way to get kids kind of really feel words out.
I also feel like with those littles, inviting parents into the classroom,
Mm-hmm.
kids love to see the people that they know. And then just that in itself, they probably wouldn't even care what they were doing if their parents were there. But then that would be a fun way to introduce the poetry to them as well.
You could even, when you said that, Becky, even if the parents didn't come in all the time, by using like Seesaw and having the kids record their poems and then ask a parent or family member to post a poem response back.
Yeah.
So whether it was through Seesaw, and I just mentioned Seesaw since I know a lot of elementaries are kind of set up using that technology, or to create kind of a Flipgrid type thing where you have the students share their poem electronically. So even as they are working on this, developing this skill, they could be posting and sharing and having different family members. I could even
I love that idea.
I love listening to teachers, because now I'm also thinking like it could be cool to have like poetry pen pals, right? And you partner with another classroom in another first grade classroom, and by using Flipgrid or another technology, your students can share a poem with that other class, and then that class of students like responds back with a poem, and you're kind of having this pen pal activity with poetry.
And I'd like to say, if anyone does such a thing, and if they can get the permissions, I would love to post that on our Poetry Out Loud website. I think that would just be so delightful. I just think that would be a great idea.
Another idea with that is a lot of schools, I know my children's schools do like third grade and first grade reading buddies, and second and kindergarten or whatever. That would be another one to perform together, because then they would have the older partner to help them out and things like that.
I was just thinking in Seesaw, there is an option when parents comment, they can make comments on the videos. There is a voice recording option for comments. And so I was thinking something like the children could record a poem on Seesaw, and then parents, instead of typing a comment back, could record something, some sort of a different version of the poem or an extension or something like that. It'd be neat.
Well, and you could, as the teacher, right, since you can push things out, you could push out a poem response, right, that you send to the parents, and the kids don't need to know that you shared that with all of the parents. And then the voice response can be, the instructions are, okay, parents, respond by reciting the poem that I sent to you back to your child.
I'd like to share something that that Rebecca and I did at a previous school we were at, and that was Poetry Moment. And the third graders memorized very short poems, and they would take a little bell and they'd run down the hallway, knock on a door and open the door and say, "Poetry moment, poetry moment." And then they would recite their poem to whatever class would open the door for them. And it was just a really fun, energized way of really engaging the whole school in poetry. And it was amazing how much fun everybody had memorizing poems.
Love that.
Timothy Murphy, a friend of mine, would talk about using poetry as talking with generations of people. So the whole respond, you read the poem, then you respond to the poem. So there's that aspect of poetry as an art form. This is also, doing something where you're responding with the parents and everything. It's almost like it's living out that real poetic part. I'm trying to think of the right word, but I can't think of it right now. But the way in which poet takes one idea and then responds to the idea by writing a different poem, or they'll take a poem and write a response to that.
I like what you said too, like it is an art form, and it's one thing I've been encouraging school principals is that, especially with the passage of ESSA, where they want to have this a wider breadth of curriculum, is to think about poetry as a form of art. It's literature, but it's also art, and it's a great way, especially when you move into the performance part of it. And that performance for the younger ones can be as simple as a poetry moment, or just I love the what is the process you called now?
The seesaw.
The seesaw. Yeah, I love that. I got to look that one up. I love that idea, being able to share that back with the parents, and I think that's just really pretty cool.
Yeah, there are so many different ways to take this. Becky shared in the chat some of the things that she does of helping them create their own poetry. And to your point about it being an art, there are so many things that you can do as extensions, right? So each student finds this poem that they love, and they have to draw a response. Like, what does this poem evoke for them visually? They maybe have to write a short write. Nikki posted at the beginning of just kind of a short write, just a reflection. And then they have this performance piece, and then maybe they ask someone of a different generation to just respond to the piece. So they could have this like multi-layered, like little poem portfolio, little thing that they create of just different artistic responses to this one thing using a variety of medium, right? So they would have used art, they would have used writing, they would have used video, or audio, and they would be playing with all of these multimedia formats just to respond to a relatively short thing. And I think that's the other thing that I like about poems. I know that sounds kind of awful, but I like that you can read a lot of poems in a short amount of time.
That's exactly one of the things.
Not like reading a novel, where it takes you 6 weeks to go through this piece. You can really dive in and like really explore this content in a couple days.
It's readily accessible to students at all levels. And that's what makes poetry such a great tool for doing literacy work with students. Speaking of that, working with images and poetry, one of the processes that I've been using in the state, and in fact Hazen Elementary has adopted it school-wide, is the picturing writing process with Beth Olshansky. Those of you who are elementary teachers, I'd really encourage you to look at that, how instead of reading the poem and then drawing the picture, she starts with the art process of all of the students creating their own works of art first, and then writing the poetry to that work of art. And the level of literacy just skyrockets because they've created their own image, and they have that image in front of them, and now they're going to write to it. And she has it so scaffolded. She has a great book out there that you can purchase and learn how to do that in your own classroom. But the poetry that the students write, I believe there is actually, oh, there you are. Yes, you're so fast. Yeah, if you can look at any of the examples, the picturing writing, she does a whole poetry unit with students that is, and again, she's research-based. Has had some wonderful dissemination grants where she's proven the impact of this program using this type of a picturing writing process with children, and how it improves their writing skills and reading. So those of you who are elementary teachers, I really would suggest that you look at that and maybe buy her book or call me. I have extra books. I'd be happy to send you one. If you just send me an email, I have some back in my cupboard. I'd be very happy to send it out to you. A couple of her books.
And one thing I'd like to mention too with poetry, making things more text readability, more accessible for my first graders. My first graders are reading at a level C and D. And so in text level, that would be, I see the cat, she is big. I see the dog, she is little, that type of thing. But just last week we were reading a poem, Read to Me by Jane Yolen. And when you dig into the complexity of that text level, and we worked with it, we did some shared reading, and then the kids did read it, upload it onto Seesaw. We talked about working on fluency, and because it's poetry and it's high interest, they're reading at such, the text level they're reading is so much more difficult than what they can read in a text. And so it's really neat, and gives my kids a boost of confidence, and it makes the parents go, oh my gosh, I can't believe they can read that. So
and think of high school students who struggle too. And I mean, there again, I think your example of working with students at the elementary level who are struggling, I think this using poetry as a tool could have a good impact, a really wonderful impact on our high school students too. It makes it more accessible.
I think that the idea of crafting again, I like to use it and, read the poem, but change one of the words into something else. And then, it really gets people to think about, well, okay, he used a C letter word there because the K sound actually helps with the other sounds. And if you change that to a W word, it's going to change the whole sound of the poem. And I think that just that level of thinking about writing is kind of next level. Kids don't think like that very often, but when you are looking at just a small piece of writing, that every word counts and every word has a meaning and has multiple meanings in that case, because of the way it sounds, where it is in the sentence, and what it's saying about, and what context clues or what contextual things come up besides the dictionary definition. It gets kids thinking on much higher levels.
I like ending on that note. Personally, selfishly, I think that it was a nice button for us of just kind of that reminder about poetry and the beauty and the power of it. So thanks everyone for joining us tonight to talk about poetry and poetry out loud specifically. I hope you have some ideas, no matter where you're teaching and what you're teaching. I hope you have a few ideas percolating for how you might really utilize poetry to stimulate your young speakers, listeners, writers, and readers in different ways by using this different type of text. I just love how these conversations snowball and one thing becomes something else, and then we all things that we can do. So thank you, Rebecca. Thank you for Brian for sharing your expertise on poetry out loud specifically. And thanks to the rest of you for sharing all of your poetry ideas. All right. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Bye.